Hello everyone, welcome back for more human physiology. So now that we've had a good discussion on the cerebrum, really mostly discussion on the cerebral cortex, let's move a little bit deeper and talk about some of the basal nuclei. So we've already taken note of the fact that a good deal of the gray matter of the cerebrum is located in the cerebral cortex, this outermost region. The only other places that we're going to find any gray matter are in these structures that are located much more internal and embedded within the white matter, and these are called basal nuclei. Let me give you a warning. You will sometimes, when you're reading about these things, some people like to refer to them as basal ganglia. Well, I'm telling you that is not the proper way to do it. These are basal nuclei because this is located in the central nervous system. As you will recall, ganglia and ganglion, the singular of it, those are terms that are reserved for the peripheral nervous system. So it would not be appropriate to call them basal ganglia. We call them basal nuclei. Some others will refer to these as subcortical structures because they are beneath the cortex, which seems to make sense. So some of the structures that we can kind of take note of here are what is called the striatum, which is a combination of two structures called the caudate nucleus and the putamen. You will see the globus pallidus here. You will see a couple of other structures. We can see just kind of the back parts of the thalamus here on either side. This is kind of a funky looking section here. So each one of these structures that is kind of colored in blue or a little bit red here, those are each their own basal nucleus. And generally speaking, most of the basal nuclei will be present on both the left and the right hemisphere. So the basal nuclei have a variety of different functions, but most of what they do is they act as relay centers. We've already seen how the thalamus acts as a very important relay center in afferent pathways. Once we get some of those afferent signals coming into the brain, they go to the thalamus first, and the thalamus will then relay them to the appropriate parts of the cerebral cortex. The other basal nuclei are going to have very similar functions. They're going to act as relay centers so that we pass information along and information goes to the right places. So in this diagram here, you can see a number of different subcortical structures like the striatum, which we mentioned, the globus pallidus. You can see the substantia nigra. You can see the thalamus down here. So there are plenty of basal nuclei. What you are looking at here is a very complicated pathway, which is called a motor circuit. So thankfully, you're not going to be tasked with trying to memorize this or try to describe it in any sort of detail. I just want you to kind of appreciate what we are trying to accomplish here. So you'll notice here that everything starts up at top in the cerebral cortex. So in terms of motor signals, efferent signals, everything we've already established will start in the cortex. The idea of an efferent signal is we want the signal to go from the cortex to wherever that signal is supposed to go. Usually it's going to be moving muscles around, right? So again, say you step on a Lego. Well, you're going to have particular cell bodies in your motor cortex of your frontal lobe signaling down through your brainstem, down through your spinal cord, to skeletal muscles in your leg so that you can pull your leg off the ground and hop around in pain, right? Well, here's the deal. That efferent signal is not going straight from the cortex to the muscles in your leg. What is essentially going to happen here is that the efferent signal basically goes through what we might call a first or rough draft. Think of it kind of like this. Say that you type up kind of a sensitive email to someone. You want to make sure that you're saying exactly the right thing. You don't want to screw anything up. You want to make sure your email is eloquent and it's absolutely perfect. Say you're sending an email to your boss or something. Well, say that you've typed up your email, you think it looks good, but you want to send it off to some of your friends and say, hey, can you proofread this? Does it all look okay? So say you send your email off to several friends for them to proofread. Well, your friends will get back to you and some of them will say, okay, this part is good, this part is good. You should probably ditch this part or you should reword this part. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your friend's feedback and adjust your initial email so that it looks a little bit better based on their feedback. That is not unlike what is happening here in a motor cortex. The cortex is sending an efferent message that eventually is going to get to some muscle, right? Well, what each of these relay centers are doing, what each of the basal nuclei are doing, are receiving the first draft of that signal and reworking it a little bit, reconfiguring it and fine-tuning it, and then sending it back to the cortex so that the cortex can more fine-tune what that efferent signal is going to be before it goes to the muscle. So what we're looking at here is in this motor circuit, the cortex sends a message to the striatum. You can see these blue arrows here indicate that we are utilizing the neurotransmitter glutamate, which is going to usually always be excitatory. The striatum will then respond by sending messages out to both these these two basal nuclei here, the globus pallidus and then this complex over here. And this time it utilizes the neurotransmitter GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, which is always going to be an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So that will then lead to a signal being sent to the thalamus. So this is a very complicated looking pathway here. Even I kind of sometimes struggle with exactly wording what exactly is going on here. Well, what you'll notice is that after these relay centers kind of pass their ideas back and forth, the information eventually makes its way back to the cortex. So this is kind of what I was indicating, that these relay centers kind of bounce these ideas back and forth until it eventually goes back to where the information started, and the cortex can now fine-tune what it is going to send exactly to the particular muscle that you're going to move in response to stepping on a Lego, right? So instead of moving every single muscle in your leg, you maybe are going to send a message to a very, very specific group of muscles in your leg. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about promoting certain muscle movements while also inhibiting others. You don't want every single muscle in your leg to all contract at the same time. So like I said, you're not going to be responsible for remembering any particular fine detail of this. I just want you to kind of have a general idea of what the purpose of these basal nuclei is. So don't focus too much on the details here. Okay, so let's talk about a different group of basal nuclei. This is what's called collectively the limbic system. It consists of structures called the cingulate gyrus, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. So generally speaking, these nuclei are involved in things such as your ability to learn and retain information, and then also in a lot of emotion, things like fear and things of that nature. So we're not going to talk about these things in a ton of detail, although we certainly could have some very detailed and fascinating discussions on that. But this is basically, we're basically going to leave it at this. So if you want to look into these things further, you are certainly welcome to. But all you really need to know for the time being is that these particular structures are involved in fear, emotion, and our ability to commit things to memory and learn over time. The Diencephalon, if we go a little bit further down, we see the structures of the thalamus, which we've already talked about as one of our major relay centers in the basal nuclei, and then the hypothalamus and the pituitary. A little bit of fun trivia. The word hypothalamus literally means below the thalamus, so you can see here that that kind of makes sense. The hypothalamus is below the thalamus. Well, thankfully, we don't really need to talk a whole lot about the hypothalamus and pituitary because we are already at this point very familiar with their endocrine activities. The thalamus we have already talked about a little bit, acting as a major relay center in a lot of our sensory or afferent pathways. And in addition to that, it's also a very useful landmark for kind of establishing, anatomically speaking, where are you in the brain. We can refer to a lot of locations in the brain by referring to where that structure is located in reference to the thalamus. So in addition to a lot of the endocrine activities that we've talked about with the hypothalamus, it's also going to be a very common sensor/control center in a lot of our autonomic nervous system pathways, and it can also play a role in the limbic system in terms of taking information from the limbic system regarding things that are giving us fearful or emotional stimuli, and the hypothalamus can direct the secretion of the proper hormone to make sure that we feel those particular emotions. So that's going to do it for this video. Next time we are going to go even further down, and we are going to start talking about the brainstem, which consists of the midbrain and the hindbrain. So I will see you next time. Bye-bye.